Welcome, and happy non-specific yet easily inferable holidays. 'Tis the season for giving, so this winter I intend to give you the gift of tax reform. Previously, in Rebuilding the Political Dichotomy, I explained how the right and left are divided between individualist and collectivist policies, and how we must reconcile the two together in a way which satisfies both sides' mutual interest in liberty and justice. Today I offer one such compromise referred to as Geo-Libertarianism. It's going to be a long video, so strap in. Here we go. What is Geo-Libertarianism? Well, Geo-Libertarianism can be described as a sort of green libertarianism, being a fusion of the principles advocated for by predominantly capitalist libertarians and predominantly socialist greens, namely civil liberties, social justice, free markets, and environmentalism. Long considered to be mutually exclusive principles, being that one argues interventionism and the other argues against it, I will attempt to show that both concepts can peaceably coexist. The linchpin here is the economic philosophy commonly referred to as Georgism, or more broadly, Geoism, which is named after Henry George following his 1879 book Progress and Poverty, which sought to discover why poverty persists despite widespread economic and technological progress. In it, Henry George presented what he called a remedy to income inequality, and what we now refer to as capitalism, without resorting to socialism. What it entailed was essentially a radical tax reform proposal conditioned upon the reconsideration of land as private property into public property. But before we dive in, let's back up and define some terms first. Wealth is said to be derived from three sources: land, labor, and capital, represented by rent, wages, and interest respectively. Rent is wealth repaid for the use of land, wages are wealth repaid for the use of labor, and interest is wealth repaid for the use of capital, which we here define as a form of wealth which produces still other wealth. Product is the sum total of wealth generated, and later on we'll use the term improvements to describe improvements made to land, which includes housing and infrastructure. Now that that's out of the way, let's rephrase the question Henry George originally set out to answer. Why don't wages rise with productivity? On its face, this question should seem absurd. After all, it contravenes what is one of the most basic principles of market economics, if not human behavior. People seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion. And it makes no sense to suggest that an increase to the productive power of labor would incentivize higher wages. There's no causal factor. Even if we were to credit the increased productivity to labor, you'd essentially be asking an employer to justify wealth they've already received by investing in it post hoc. As absurd as it is to suggest that increased wages follow increased productivity, this is a very old and very popular myth. So old, in fact, that in the mid-1800s, socialist Ferdinand Lassalle attempted to rebut such claims in coining the term the iron law of wages, which, roughly translated and paraphrased, states, the average wages are always reduced to the level of consumption necessary for subsistence. Subsistence generally refers to what we would call a living wage, but here more accurately refers to the minimum threshold at which the same level of productivity can be sustained. Basically paying workers as little as possible without them quitting or dying outright. Lassalle believed the solution to this was to abolish entrepreneurship, convert existing enterprises into cooperatives, and to reappropriate financial interventions by the state for the wealthy to the poor. Alas, socialism falls to the same sword as capitalism. People seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion. It is in acknowledging this principle that socialists correctly identify the cause of inequity, but it is ignoring this principle that they fail to identify the cause of inefficiency. For if a capitalist can reduce the wages they pay for the same labor, a socialist can reduce their labor for the same wages they're paid. This zero-sum game between equity and efficiency is an enduring cause of political conflict, and sits at the root of debate surrounding minimum wage, at-will employment, and especially taxes. To help illustrate, socialists generally advocate higher taxes, seeking to redistribute wealth and reduce inequity. By contrast, capitalists generally advocate lower taxes, seeking to preserve wealth and reduce inefficiency. Neither system explicitly discriminates between taxes. It is just generally asserted that taxes are a means of achieving justice at the implied expense of liberty. This seems an apt moment to introduce classical economist David Ricardo, who in 1817, as part of an ongoing debate with Thomas Malthus, both of whom inspired Lassalle's law of wages by the way, coined Ricardo's law of rent. In his book The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, he said, Mr. Malthus presented to the world the true doctrine of rent, without the knowledge of which it is impossible to understand the effect of the progress of wealth on profits and wages, or to trace satisfactorily the influence of taxation on different classes of the community, particularly when the commodities taxed are the productions immediately derived from the surface of the earth. The law of rent states that rent is determined by the excess of its production over that which the same application can secure from the least productive land in use. The least productive land in use can be called the margin of production. The margin of production is the best available opportunity, in a given place and time, for labor to employ itself. The law of wages can be described in the same terms. Wages are determined by the yield labor can obtain at the highest point of natural productiveness open to it without paying rent. Essentially, both of these laws are logical extrapolations from the same old principle. People seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion. Rent is only as high as the cheapest land of equal value. Any lower and you waste profits, any higher and you can't compete. Likewise, wages are only as high as the cheapest labor of equal value. Any lower and you waste profits, any higher and you can't compete. This holds true even when the cost of land and labor is zero. Given free conditions, no one would work for someone else if they could make the same amount working for themselves. And by extension, no one would work on someone else's land if they could make the same amount working on their own land.
Labor and capital can't do any producing unless they have access to land. So the first consideration is how much do they have to pay to get access to land. So the total product minus wages plus interest equals rent. On the best grade of land, the average person can produce 9 units of wealth. On the second best land, the average person can produce 8 units of wealth, etc. Now, the best available land that hasn't been put into use yet is where the average person can produce 6 units of wealth, but since there's more of that land available for free, they can have that land without having to pay rent. Now, if someone wants to work on better land, they're going to have to pay the difference between what they could get where the land is free and the additional advantage of the land that's already owned by someone.
And so arises the central question my entire narrative has been leading up to. What if there is no rent-free land? The father of capitalism, Adam Smith himself, knew the answer when in 1776 he wrote in The Wealth of Nations, "The rent of land is naturally a monopoly price. It is not at all proportioned to what the landlord may have laid out upon the improvement of the land, or to what he can afford to take, but to what the farmer can afford to give." If you've ever played the game Monopoly, you already understand this basic principle. Originally called the Landlord's game, the purpose of Monopoly was to demonstrate the injustice implicit in land grabbing, and how it is then leveraged to increase one's own wealth at the expense of others. Let's briefly review how Monopoly is traditionally played. All players begin with an equal opportunity to increase their own wealth. They each then explore the game board and acquire properties at random. Once a property is secured, other players may be subject to rent if they chance upon it, increasing the wealth of the property owner proportional to the quantity and/or quality of properties they control. Players are even given the option to invest in improvements and trade their properties, optimizing their total productivity. Once all properties are controlled, the game eventually resolves by hemorrhaging players of rent, funneling wealth towards the player with the most productive ratio of quantity and quality properties, only ending in the bankruptcy of all other players. John Stuart Mill, one of the inspirations for Henry George's Progress and Poverty, had this to say: "The ordinary progress of a society which increases in wealth is at all times tending to augment the incomes of landlords, to give them both a greater amount and greater proportion of the wealth of the community, independently of any trouble or outlay incurred on themselves. They grow richer, as it were in their sleep, without working, risking, or economizing. What claim have they on the general principle of social justice to this accession of riches?" It is evident that a degree of skill is involved in investing and trading intelligently, but it is also evident that neither is necessarily required to win the game, as the vast majority of wealth can be acquired by luck, just as the first player with $400 to land on Boardwalk becomes a force to be reckoned with. All of this is assuming that no properties are owned at the start of the game, yet as an allegory to real life, all properties are already owned by other players, and you must pay rent to all of them, with little more than the $200 wage you earn when you pass go.
Now here is a desert. Here is a caravan going along over the desert. Here is a gang of robbers. They say, "Look, there is a rich caravan. Let us go and rob it. Kill the men if necessary, take their goods from them, their camels and horses, and walk off." But one of the robbers says, "Oh no, that is dangerous. Besides, that would be stealing. Let us, instead of doing that, go ahead to where there is a spring, the only spring at which this caravan can get water in the desert. Let us put a wall around it and call it ours, and when they come up, we won't let them have any water until they've given us all the goods they have. That would be more gentlemanly, more polite, and more respectable. But would it not be theft all the same? And is it not theft of the same kind when people go ahead in advance of population and get land they have no use whatever for, and then, as people come into the world and population increases, will not let this increasing population use the land until they pay an exorbitant price?"
There was, however, another way to play the game. Elizabeth Maggie, the creator of Landlord's game, originally offered an alternative set of rules called prosperity, which players could, by majority vote, switch to at any time. The first rule of prosperity reads as follows: abolish all taxes, and instead pay the specified land rents into the Prosperity Land Rent Fund of the public treasury, keeping such money separate from all other monies. The landlord retains only the rent for improvements, if any, and at once turns over all the land rent to the Prosperity Land Rent Fund of the public treasury. Rules 2 and 3 go on to detail how it is from the Prosperity Land Rent Fund that all public utility spaces are purchased and operated before land rent is then rerouted into the general fund, substituting taxes. In this version of the game, victory is not determined by elimination, but by the poorest player doubling their starting funds. This, in essence, is what is called the land value tax, single tax, or LVT, and is the remedy to which Henry George refers to in his book, Progress and Poverty. A tax upon the value of lands is therefore the most just and equal of all taxes. It falls only upon those who receive from society a peculiar and valuable benefit, and upon them in proportion to the benefit they receive. It is the taking by the community, for the use of the community, of that value which is the creation of the community. In the simplest possible terms, the land value tax is functionally a user fee made in exchange for the privilege of excluding others from a piece of land. It is rent paid to the community in exchange for and in proportion to the opportunity costs using it creates. There are other natural implications the system would have as well. For one, it would streamline the absolute bureaucratic clusterfuck of a tax system we already have. No longer would the government have to track incomes, payrolls, properties, estates, capital gains, inheritances, sales, gifts. Instead, land is immobile. You can't hide it. And since its value is contingent upon the community, it can be transparently assessed and collected. Now, much as it's touted as the single tax, it's not beyond the pale to extrapolate the same principles to other productive forms of revenue. For example, if we consider the Earth's geographical space and resources to be the common property of all people, a Pigouvian tax on negative externalities such as excessive waste or pollution would, like all other taxes, help to mitigate those things, and in fact incentivize businesses to pursue clean energy and waste management solutions as a method of legitimized tax evasion. That just makes sense. And something else that I think is worth noting is that both of these taxes are implicitly progressive taxes, meaning they disproportionately target wealthier people. This is practical for obvious reasons, but the important distinction here I want to make is that we're not discriminating against rich people. Individual success should be encouraged, but not in a manner which comes at the expense of the collective, which land value taxes and Pigouvian taxes explicitly target. None of this vague presumption of guilt shit. The view of land as common property goes all the way back to antiquity, and while I've mentioned several prominent advocates of the concept, there were many others who thought along the same lines. John Locke, in his Second Treatise of Government, said man has the right to earth he labors upon, at least where there is enough and is good left in common for others. Thomas Paine, in Agrarian Justice, said, the earth in its natural uncultivated state was the common property of the human race. What's especially interesting to note here is that Thomas Paine had outlined his own plan for taxing landowners, and from it, he wished to fund retirement pensions, welfare for people incapable of work, and even a basic income. And you know, this really highlights something I think which is a gross misconception of libertarians and fiscal conservatives in general. We're not against safety nets in principle, we just object to how they're paid for. And of course, we don't want those safety nets to become hammocks either, or to put the country in debt. Henry George believed the totality of rent should be paid back to the community in the form of a citizen's dividend. But it's the community's money, so it's the community's choice to spend that money as it sees fit. If it decides to trade some of that equity for, say, certain public utilities, that's fine. We're no longer arguing over the ethics of imposing that cost on people's hard work. That alone should bridge the gap between the political left and right on countless policies. And sure enough, these same ideas have been echoed, if not directly cited, by many different people throughout the years.
Men like Henry George are rare, unfortunately. One cannot imagine a more beautiful combination of intellectual keenness, artistic form, and fervent love of justice. Albert Einstein. People do not argue with the teaching of George, they simply do not know it. The teaching of George is irresistibly convincing in its simplicity and clearness. He who becomes acquainted with it cannot but agree. Leo Tolstoy. I have made speeches to you by the yard on the taxation of land values, and you know what a strong supporter I have always been of that policy. Winston Churchill. I believe in the taxation of land values only. Justice Louis D. Brandeis. A reform like this will be worked out sometime in the future. Abraham Lincoln.
Now, much as I feel I've made a pretty potent case here, I'm sure you still have some objections rattling around in your head, like, how would you compensate existing landlords? Wouldn't this disproportionately impact agriculture? Is LVT really enough to cover the cost of government? I believe these are all easily answered questions, which you can find addressed on the Georgism subreddit or on a related FAQs, both of which I'll link in the video description with additional sources, by the way. I will, however, address one standing criticism. Some libertarians will understandably have difficulty swallowing some of the arguments I've put forward here. Friedrich Hayek and Murray Rothbard both expressed a shared dissatisfaction with the notion of state assessments of land value, saying such estimations wouldn't be fair or sufficiently precise when compared to the free market. While I don't believe this criticism is enough to justify the private ownership of land, I actually agree with it. The implied bureaucracy of centralized land assessment does seem like a significant downside to land value tax. At least, that's what I thought until I heard this.
Yes, well, you can keep possession of a piece of land, you can keep living on it, you keep working on it, keep staying on it. The only thing is you just have to return the rental value of that land to the community. So as long as you do that, you've got equal security to tenure to what you do now. It doesn't really change anything on a fundamental level. All it does is where the rent is going. I mean, right now you're paying rent on the land you occupy, so the rent just goes to public use instead of private use. That's the fundamental difference.
And Henry George, in Progress and Poverty on page 384, he wrote, "This simple device of placing all taxes on the value of land would be in effect putting up the land at auction to whosoever would pay the highest rent to the state."
And that got me thinking. After mulling it around a bit, I now believe it's actually entirely possible to run a decentralized, market-based land value tax system. And here's how it would work. All land would be subject to recurring auctions. At the expiry of their lease, an existing landowner would submit their land for auction, attaching to it a reserve price of their choice for any improvements made to it. Bidders must accept the reserve price before making bids. The highest bidder then pays the reserve price all at once or in periodic installments directly to the previous owner, as compensation for the improvements, which again include housing, infrastructure, etc. The bid then represents the rent owed to the state, which may recur on a weekly, monthly, or even yearly basis. The deed transfers to the new tenant, and the tenant moves in. And to prevent people from becoming entrenched behind an artificially high reserve price, landowners may be ejected from the premises if they fail to secure any bids, and made to continue paying rent until they can auction the land at an acceptable reserve price. So unless I've made some catastrophic mistake, this method should guarantee against multiple concerns. First, all improvements will sell at true market value. Second, all land will sell at true market value, separate their improvements. And third, this forces all land into circulation and use, where people pay what they can and wealth determines priority, not access. This would unilaterally solve your housing crisis.
Now see the absurdity of the present system, even as a great economic measure. Here in Glasgow, take that field of Burnbank. The owner allows it to be vacant and pays nothing, but if he puts houses upon it, you will then get £7,000 a year in taxation. Have you got enough houses in Glasgow? Why should you tax houses and not land? The person who puts up houses is a public benefactor. The more you tax houses, the less houses you have. But you may tax the value of land 20 shillings to the pound, and you will not have an inch less land.
And if you're still unconvinced or just can't get over the idea of impermanent housing, think about this. Over 2 million people rent public housing in Hong Kong on a month-to-month basis already. Over 4 million people rent public housing in Singapore on 99-year leases. And I couldn't find numbers on Japan, but I did stumble upon this article by the National Bureau of Economic Research from 1994, which discusses land inflation and has this section right at the end that I found super interesting. Efficiency versus equity. A philosophy of public policy regarding to land and housing, protection of the underprivileged is most frequently mentioned in Japan. A close examination, however, reveals that taxes and regulations with an intention of protecting the underprivileged often have the opposite effect. For example, the building lease law that overly protects the tenant discourages the supply of high-quality rental housing, so that potential tenants for that market are hurt. There is an analogy to rent control in the United States. Low assessments for real estate taxes and bequest taxes are often defended by the same argument. It is against the philosophy of protecting the underprivileged if market values are assessed in full when the land price is skyrocketing. It is a pity if a long-term resident has to sell a home and move due to real estate taxes. However, reducing the assessment encourages the underuse of land while waiting for capital gains and death of the owner. Heavy subsidies to corporate and government employee housing also work against the development of high-quality housing. Hence, tax system and regulations regarding the philosophy may turn out to be counterproductive for efficient use of land. A proper balance between efficiency and equity and not just an attempt to lower land prices, must be sought in future tax reform and regulatory changes with regard to land use. That is exactly what I've been saying. And it's a real shame that all three of these countries are experiencing severe economic problems right now. But this just goes to demonstrate why libertarianism is a necessary, if not implied, complement to Georgism. I know I've spent the majority of time here trying to talk down capitalists, but I really, really have to stress the importance of this to the socialists in the audience. The more taxes and regulations you put on the market, the more you strangle people's ability to move freely through it.
If we want people to be producing wealth, if we want people to be thrifty and saving money and doing all the good things, producing wealth in society, we need to get off their backs. We need to stop taxing them. I mean, it's just, I don't think anybody really, until they've thought about it deeply, realises the irony of this situation. The moment someone does anything that's economically useful, that benefits society, that helps build the economy, the government immediately descends on them and gives them a beating for it.
Let me try to explain this as simple as possible. You look at something like minimum wage and you think, this seems like a reasonable precaution. But when you do, you increase the cost of hiring people. That means higher costs to run a business, and that creates a financial disincentive to hire people. You look at something like just cause termination and you think, this seems like a reasonable precaution. But when you do, you increase the cost of firing people. That means higher costs to run a business, and that further increases the financial disincentive to hire people. All of a sudden, wow, look at this unemployment rate, and it's so cost prohibitive to start a business now. How do we solve that? Well, let's increase welfare spending and subsidize businesses. And what does that do? That raises taxes, and since you disproportionately target wealthier people, that increases the cost of living, and that further increases the cost of running businesses. You keep chasing the consequences of your own policies over and over and over and over again until it snowballs into an economic collapse, and then finally, you're like, okay, we need to bail out some of these companies and inject the economy with funny money. That'll fix things. And what does that do? That decreases the value of your currency, which increases the cost of living, which rationalizes jacking up the minimum wage, starting the whole cycle all over again, and this is exactly what's happening in Venezuela right now. And what's the excuse for this? Job security?
One of the features of contemporary economic systems is what's called imposing flexibility in labor markets. That's considered a wonderful thing. Labor markets are supposed to be flexible. It's a fancy way of saying you don't know when you go to sleep at night whether you have a job tomorrow morning. And that contributes to efficiency. Anybody who's taken an economics course understands that you get more efficiency if people have no security. They don't know what's going to happen to them tomorrow. And then you can move them around. It's just like a tool. So if you can get labor market flexibility, then you get a kind of efficiency, but of course it has a cost. For example, one of the costs is mental illness. The International Labor Organization just did a study in which they found that the incidence of mental illness among workers has increased very sharply, which they attribute plausibly to workers' insecurity.
See, the problem here is that this assumes people are always going to be insecure about losing their job. But if you can easily get another job, what are you worried about? Minimum wage means jack shit if your employers can leave for another job with better pay. That's competition, which you're jeopardizing with these invasive policies. I don't want to lose my job either, but it's not because I like my job. It's because it's so hard to find a new one. Why do you think that is? I keep saying it, but it never fails to fall on deaf ears. The left constantly complains about big business, and the right constantly complains about big government. Doesn't it make sense that the cause of our problems might be both of these things influencing each other?
I do not believe it's proper to put the situation in terms of industrialists versus government. On the contrary, one of the reasons why I am in favor of less government is because when you have more government, industrialists take it over. And the two together form a coalition against the ordinary worker and the ordinary consumer. I think business is a wonderful institution, provided it has to face competition in the marketplace, and it can't get away with something except by producing a better product at a lower cost. And that's why I don't want government to step in and help the business community.
That was Milton Friedman, by the way. And can you imagine what I have him on record as saying?
I find the income tax totally antagonistic to true free enterprise. Can we run the country without income tax?
Well, there's a sense in which all taxes are antagonistic to free enterprise. And yet, we need taxes. We have to recognize that we mustn't hope for a utopia that is unattainable. I would like to see a great deal less government activity than we have now. But I do not believe that we can have a situation in which we don't need government at all. We do need to provide for certain essential government functions, the police function, the national defense function of preserving law and order, of maintaining a judiciary. And so the question is, which are the least bad taxes? And in my opinion, and this may come as a shock to some of you, the least bad tax is the property tax on the unimproved value of land, the Henry George argument from many, many years ago.
Thanks for watching. I'm sorry I didn't get around to talking about intellectual property. I feel like that's a subject which naturally follows from this one, but that on its own would have been like a whole nother 20-minute video. So I'm gonna leave that besides and pin this at the end, just further inquiry is needed. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I realize it's not exactly a conventional breakdown or description of the subject matter, but then again, what is? It's not exactly a very well covered subject, which is kind of why I made this video. If you do want a conventional explanation, I believe a Wikipedia page does a fine job. I'll link that down in the description along with everything else I have. If you enjoyed it or got something out of it, I would appreciate it if you shared it with whom it may concern, or to whom you may find it interesting, or even disagreeable. And if you disagreed with it, go ahead and leave a comment, tell me why I'm stupid, tell me why I should be anarcho-capitalist, social democrat, or something else. And yeah, talk to you later. Thanks.
You read too much. Keep your nose out of books, except those pertaining to army regulations. What's this? Land and freedom? I'm disgusted with you.